The news broke like a thunderclap, and within minutes the sleek glass walls of Apple's Cupertino headquarters seemed to rattle with invisible tremors. Executives sat frozen around a mahogany table, faces pale as glowing screens flashed with the headline, "Beijing cuts supply chains." Factories in Shenzhen stood silent, assembly lines that once buzzed with relentless precision now dark, shipments of gleaming iPhones stranded in ports under lock and key. Billions of dollars evaporated in a single stroke, not because of market trends or consumer shifts, but because one government had tightened its fist. Outside, markets roared in panic. Investors dumped stock like it was poisoned fruit. On social media, disbelief spiraled into hysteria. Hashtags screamed across timelines. Apple crash, China shock, tech meltdown. For a company that symbolized modern innovation, this wasn't just a crisis of production. It was an existential threat. The iPhone, the MacBook, the AirPods in millions of pockets, all suddenly tethered to a geopolitical battle far bigger than any single gadget. In one night, the world's most valuable company realized its empire was at the mercy of Beijing's hand. A hand that didn't hesitate to squeeze. But even as panic spread through Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Washington alike, a storm was quietly brewing on the other side of the globe. A rival nation, long underestimated, long overshadowed, was preparing to seize its moment, and what unfolded next would shake not just Apple, but America's entire tech dominance. Apple was never just another company. It was the crown jewel of American innovation, the proof that Silicon Valley's imagination could reshape the world. But beneath the polished glass storefronts and the iconic bite-marked logo lay a dependency no glossy ad campaign could hide: China. For decades, Apple's lifeline had run through sprawling megafactories in Shenzhen and Zhengzhou, where armies of workers assembled devices at a scale no other country could match. Over 90% of Apple's hardware was built there. That wasn't a business choice, it was survival. So when Beijing's supply chain restrictions hit, the crisis rippled far beyond Cupertino's boardrooms. Millions of jobs across the globe suddenly hung in the balance. From the factory workers on Chinese assembly lines, to the American truck drivers who hauled boxes to stores, to the small app developers whose livelihoods depended on iPhones shipping on time. Trillions of dollars in market value teetered on the edge, shaking the foundations of Wall Street and rattling pension funds of everyday citizens. But this was more than economics. It was a battle for technological power, a test of whether America's most celebrated company, and by extension, America itself, was truly in control of its destiny. Could the nation that invented the modern smartphone withstand the leverage of a government willing to weaponize supply chains? Or had Silicon Valley's brilliance been quietly shackled to Beijing's will all along? And as the U.S. reeled, watching its tech icon falter, another player was waiting in the shadows. A nation often dismissed as chaotic, too unwieldy, too messy to ever rival China's machine. Yet in that very mess lay untapped potential, hungry ambition, and a chance to rewrite history. The country was India, and its moment was coming. Before we continue, let me ask for a quick favor. Our goal is to reach 5,000 subscribers, and your help is crucial. If you're enjoying this video, please subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, so you don't miss content like this. Thank you for your support. For years, China had been the beating heart of global technology manufacturing. It wasn't just the factories, the vast labyrinthine cities of steel and glass where millions labored day and night. It was the sheer precision, the ruthless efficiency, the ability to scale from an idea to a billion products without missing a beat. When the world thought of cutting-edge supply chains, they thought of China. And Beijing knew it. That dominance bred a confidence that hardened into something darker: leverage. To Beijing, supply chains weren't just infrastructure, they were weapons. If a company wanted access to the world's most skilled workforce and fastest output, it had to play by China's rules. Comply or collapse. And Apple, despite its trillion-dollar valuation, was no exception. There were warning signs, moments when Beijing flexed its power to remind the world who held the keys. American tech firms were forced to store data on Chinese soil. Google and Facebook were locked out altogether. Even when rare earth minerals, the essential ingredients of every smartphone and laptop, were threatened with export bans, Washington could only grit its teeth and watch. Each move reinforced the same lesson. China didn't just make the world's technology, it controlled it. In Beijing's eyes, this wasn't arrogance, it was destiny. The dragon had built its empire not just on labor, but on control, coercion, woven into every contract, every trade route, every handshake deal. And when the moment came to squeeze, China squeezed without hesitation, confident that no nation, no corporation, could untangle itself from its grip. But that very confidence would become its blind spot, for as Beijing tightened its hold, it failed to notice the quiet stirrings of a challenger, a rival that had been dismissed for too long, a rival with its own billion-strong population, a rival that was hungry to prove the dragon wrong, and China's very grip would soon spark its greatest rival. For decades, India stood on the sidelines of the global tech race. It was the world's largest democracy, a nation of more than 1 billion people, yet too often dismissed as too chaotic, too slow, too fractured to rival the industrial machine that China had become. Investors saw red tape, crumbling infrastructure, and messy politics, not potential. And so, while China became the factory of the world, India remained the call center, the back office, the supporting act. But beneath the surface, change was building. India's vast young workforce, skilled, ambitious, hungry, was eager for opportunity. A wave of economic reforms slashed bureaucracy and opened the doors wider to foreign investment. Modern highways carved through once forgotten regions, ports expanded, special economic zones blossomed. Where once there was hesitation, there was now a bold pitch to the world. Come, build with us. It was in this climate that Foxconn, the Taiwanese titan behind Apple's assembly lines, made a pivotal choice. For years, Foxconn had poured its future into China, feeding the dragon's empire with labor and loyalty. But the geopolitical storm clouds were too dark to ignore. Beijing's grip was tightening, and Apple, Foxconn's most important partner, needed a lifeline. The search for a new frontier led them south to India. Factories began to rise in Chennai and Bangalore, humming with the sound of opportunity. Thousands of Indian workers donned their uniforms, stepping into jobs their parents could only dream of. Every iPhone that rolled off those assembly lines carried more than circuits and screens. It carried the promise of a nation rewriting its place in history. India, long the underdog, was suddenly on the global stage. It wasn't just about manufacturing phones. It was about pride, sovereignty, and the validation of a country often underestimated. Here was a democracy proving it could do what an authoritarian giant claimed only it could achieve: build at scale, with skill, and with vision. For decades, India was overlooked. But this moment, the decision by Foxconn, the eyes of Apple turning eastward, would rewrite history. The elephant had begun to stir, and with every step the ground beneath the dragon trembled, and as the first India-made iPhones made their way into the hands of customers, one question lingered across boardrooms and capitals alike. Was this the dawn of a new tech power? The answer was about to arrive, in the form of global panic. The moment Beijing's restrictions took hold, the shockwaves slammed into Wall Street with brutal force. Apple's stock, once the golden pillar of American markets, plummeted in a single trading session. Trillions in market value teetered on the edge of collapse. Traders barked orders, eyes glued to screens flashing crimson red. Analysts whispered what had once been unthinkable. Was Apple too dependent on China to survive? In homes across America, ordinary consumers felt the tremor too. News anchors warned of delayed shipments, price spikes, and empty shelves at Apple stores. Parents worried whether their children would have laptops for school. College students wondered if their broken iPhones would ever be replaced. While America panicked and China tightened its grip, halfway across the globe a different kind of storm was gathering. Quiet, deliberate, but unstoppable. In New Delhi, Officials stepped to the podium with a confidence that few had ever associated with India's industrial past. The government announced a bold package of incentives, billions in tax breaks and subsidies designed to lure the world's biggest tech players away from Beijing's shadow. The message was clear. If China wants to weaponize supply chains, India will build new ones. The response was swift. Foxconn, Apple's indispensable partner, broke ground on sprawling new plants in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Drone footage captured the sheer scale, vast complexes rising from the earth like monuments to ambition. Inside, thousands of Indian workers were being trained with military precision, learning to handle the delicate circuits and components that had once been the guarded domain of Chinese factories. For the young men and women in those workshops, this was more than a job. It was a national calling. Each shift they worked was a strike against doubt, a declaration that India could not only compete with China, but someday surpass it. And then came the moment that no one thought possible. From Chennai's assembly lines rolled the first major shipment of India-made iPhones, gleaming in their pristine boxes. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, and social media erupted. The iconic label assembled in India wasn't just text on a sticker, it was a symbol. A symbol that Apple had options, that Beijing's monopoly wasn't unbreakable, and that the global balance of tech power was beginning to tilt. The climax arrived when Tim Cook himself appeared on stage, a smile cutting across his face as he spoke words that reverberated across continents. He praised India's talent, its infrastructure, its vision. It wasn't just a polite thank you, it was a symbolic break, a subtle but unmistakable signal that Apple's future no longer belonged solely to China. The applause that followed wasn't just for Cook. It was for India, the underdog finally claiming its moment in the spotlight. Beijing was rattled. State media fumed, dismissing India's gains as exaggerated, yet the anxiety was evident. For the first time in decades, China's aura of inevitability had cracked. If Apple could move even part of its empire, what would stop others from following? Tech analysts whispered that this was more than diversification. It was the start of a realignment that could reshape the entire global order. The dragon had felt untouchable for so long, but now the elephant had stepped into the arena. And as factories lit up across southern India and iPhones shipped proudly to global markets, one truth became impossible to ignore. The dragon had been challenged by the elephant, and the world was watching who would stumble first. The moment Apple's first India-made shipments hit the market, the digital world erupted. Social media timelines that had been drowning in panic just weeks earlier were suddenly ablaze with celebration. Hashtags flipped from despair to pride. Made in India, Apple shift, new tech era. Videos of young Indian workers proudly holding the first phones assembled in their factories went viral, drawing millions of views. Memes mocked Beijing's faltering grip, while commentators across YouTube and TikTok hailed the shift as a turning point in the global tech war. Global headlines amplified the buzz. India emerges as tech powerhouse, declared the New York Times. Apple breaks China's monopoly, shouted The Guardian. In New Delhi, leaders wasted no time framing the moment as historic. Prime Minister Modi proclaimed with conviction, "This is our century. India will not just participate in the global economy, we will lead it." The statement struck a chord, echoing across a billion hearts eager to see their nation rise. Across the ocean, U.S. politicians seized the narrative too. Senators and congressmen praised the shift, calling it the dawn of a new democratic alliance. For a country wary of its overdependence on China, India's emergence offered not just economic relief but ideological reassurance, a partnership with a fellow democracy rather than a rival authoritarian state. But Beijing did not stay silent. State media spat venom, branding the move short-sighted and warning of dire consequences for companies that dared to leave. Officials hinted at retaliation, signaling that the dragon's claws were far from dull. Yet beneath the bluster was unease. For the first time, China wasn't dictating the terms, it was reacting, and the shockwaves didn't stop with India. From Vietnam to Mexico, nations saw an opening. Leaders rolled out their own incentives, competing fiercely to host the next Apple plant, the next great pivot away from China. What began as a fracture was fast becoming a global reordering, a scramble to claim pieces of the tech empire that Beijing once considered untouchable. The aftershocks were undeniable. A world that had long bowed to China's dominance was suddenly imagining alternatives. But in moments of triumph, the deeper question remained: what lesson would history draw from this upheaval? When the dust settled, one truth towered above the chaos. Dependency on authoritarian regimes is not strength, it is weakness disguised as efficiency. For years, the world's most innovative company had tied its fate to a system that could pull the plug at will. China's grip on supply chains looked like inevitability, until it revealed itself for what it truly was: a vulnerability waiting to be exposed. And yet, from that vulnerability came resilience. Apple's pivot to India was more than a business decision. It was a declaration that no single power should hold the world hostage. The hero of this story wasn't just a corporation. It was the principle of diversification, of building bridges with nations that share values rather than silence dissent. In the long run, it is democracies, messy, complicated, sometimes slower, that prove most enduring because they rest not on fear but on trust. India's rise was proof of that. A nation once dismissed as too unwieldy had shown that democracy could scale, adapt, and rise to the challenge of history. And for millions watching, it was validation that progress doesn't require perfection, it requires determination. This saga wasn't only about Apple, or China, or India. It was about the future of technology itself. Who controls it, who benefits from it, and what values are embedded within it. The stakes weren't just economic, they were moral. Because in the end, technology isn't just built in factories. It's built on trust, freedom, and vision. And as the world looked toward the future, one thing was certain: the balance of power had shifted, and the age of unquestioned dominance was over. What came next would not be dictated by control, but by those who dared to stand tall in its face. China tried to cut Apple down, but in doing so, it may have sparked the rise of its greatest rival. What was meant to be a show of strength exposed a deep fragility, and gave India the stage it had long been denied. In that clash of power and pride, we witnessed more than a supply chain shift. We saw history bend, and now the question falls to you. How do you see the future of this triangle, America, China, and India? Will democracy and resilience chart the course ahead, or will control and coercion claw their way back? Your voice matters because stories like this aren't just headlines. They are the fabric of the world we all share. So if this story resonated with you, don't just watch. Be part of it. Subscribe, share this video with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Together we shape the conversation that shapes tomorrow. The question isn't whether Apple survives. It's which nation writes the future of technology.